Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Before the break, I indicated that my hope for seeing action out of this motion, I expressed appreciation for the fact that members on different benches expressed support for the principles of parliamentary autonomy. And I want to continue, Mr. Vice President, by mentioning a few countries, a number of countries where they have managed to have systems in place to protect the parliament, insulate the parliament from the political influence of the minister, whoever he or she may be. The three I want to mention is in Canada, the UK, and in Scotland. In Canada, there is a managing body called the Board of Internal Economy. And it is a statutory body that deals with all the financial and administrative matters with respect to the House of Commons. And the House itself, its premises, its services, and the staff. And they have an Act of Parliament which makes provisions for that. In the United Kingdom, there's the House of Commons, and the House of Commons has its own administration, and they operate under their own act, which was passed in 1978. In the UK, their principal managing body is the House of Commons Commission. So the Speaker of the House chairs the Commission, and the Commission will prepare all the financial estimates and so on, which would be laid in the House as part of the normal budgetary process. So there is no real formal role for the Treasury, for the Minister of Finance, and that feature gives the Parliament a large degree of independence. In Scotland, their system has a number of unique features. They have established a body called the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, and it is generally referred to as the Parliamentary Corporation, to perform the function of providing for Parliament or to ensure that Parliament is provided with the property, the staff, and the services required for their purpose. In Australia, the Australian Department of Parliamentary Services has its own separate and amendable appropriation bill. So they can amend it, but it's very separate. So the federal government has adopted a system which distances itself, its funding from the funding of the government services in general. So the funding of that commission is separate from the general funding provided to the ministries and so on. Mr. Vice President, these are matters that we could consider if there is a joint select committee. I mentioned that while there are a number of things that I wanted to share with regards to endorsing the the parliamentary autonomy, that is not what this debate is about. The speaker from the government side, the only speaker on the government side thus far, actually did something I intended to do, which was quote the PNM's manifesto. The PNM's manifesto would have been drafted prior to September 2015. Since before 2015, the people who now sit in government promised this nation that they would bring parliamentary autonomy. To date, you have had no action. We are in March of 2018. To say that the date provided by Senator Mark when he moved this motion of April 30th, 2018 is too short. To say that that would give this parliament just over a month or a few weeks is totally misleading. This PNM if they really meant what they said in the manifesto, they would be ready to bring legislation and to keep their promises to the country. I would have thought that if you had that promise in your manifesto, you would have had some consultation, you would have had some ideas, you would have something, some plan, some draft. Of course, you would do the necessary in terms of taking it to the Attorney General to firm up the legislation, the structure of the legislation. But certainly, I would expect that since prior to coming into office, you made this promise, that you would be prepared when you come in to office. To say that and I know what they'll do, you know. All the speakers on the opposite side will say, I agree with the principles. However, and they find a loop. They find an escape clause, and the escape clause will be April 30th, 2018. I can tell you that is what all of them will say. So your escape clause is that it's too short. And I'm saying if you really genuinely mean to bring the legislation, then you would propose to amend the motion, you would propose to have another date that you think is reasonable, and you would ensure that the Parliament Services Authority Bill comes to Parliament and is debated as it should. So as much as we talk about democracy, you know, Mr. Vice President, they say that democracy is by far the most challenging form of government. Because you can't just come and say so and it will be done. You have an opposition who is a watchdog. You have people who are keeping you in check. And that is the power of people. And today, Mr. Vice President, I am wondering if this will be one of the numerous broken promises of this government. Because the truth is that there are many pressing issues, there are many pressing matters in society now. Mr. Vice President, in my opening, I paid tribute to a woman, and I spoke about the issue and concern we have about the number of women who are being murdered. I am sure we could talk about that. I am sure we could talk about protecting our women and girls. I am sure we could talk about other issues with regards to education, with regards to public health care, with regards to crime. But the fact is, I know we must find space for everything. And as we continue to treat with the problems that present themselves in society now, the present issues, we must not forget that part of our duty as a parliament is to preserve our democracy and the future of our nation by ensuring that the rights enshrined in our Constitution in terms of the political rights and the rights of free and fair elections, to ensure that our institutions, the independence of our institutions, including the Parliament, including the court, and so on, that they are protected. So that is part of our duty. Mr. Vice President, Senator Mark has spoken on numerous occasions about parliamentary independence and empowering the Parliament. But this motion is unique in that this is not a matter that was first raised by Senator Mark or only spoken about by Senator Mark. Mr. Vice President, I want to ask the government and any speaker who may speak, whether it is in this debate or in the public forum, or any public forum, whether it's through the media, I want to ask you, please do not mislead the country for yet another occasion. You have misled this country on a number of issues. Please do not stand and patronize the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Please don't come here and say nice words in support of parliamentary autonomy because it sounds good. And I am asking you to work with the Parliament, the staff, the independent and government benches to make this a reality. If your intention is good, and if your intention is what you outlined in your manifesto, please make a commitment, even if you want to change the date by which you will deliver. But let us make a firm commitment today that we will make good on that promise that you made in your manifesto. Mr. Vice President, there are a number of other other things that worry me. When I hear the members of the government, when I heard the members of the government in that debate we had in May of 2017, I was very optimistic. I was, for the first time as a senator, hearing the government's commitment. This was a motion that was moved by Senator Mark. He is in opposition, and all of the speakers on the other side sounded as though they were in support of it. So that motion at that time asked the Parliament to more or less agree to financial and administrative autonomy for the Parliament. So at that time, I think we were all in agreement. Since that occasion, that debate, a number of individual members have changed, but certainly the government, by and large, remains the same. Many of the ministers are still in office. Some have been disposed of, but some of them keep coming back. No, well, no, not in a negative way. They have been removed, or, you know, and some just keep coming back. But the fact is, Mr. Vice President, that the government is the same government of that day, and the opposition is the same opposition. So the government had an opportunity to talk. And I am saying, even if not in 2015, when you made all your promises to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, in May of 2017, you had a debate here. You made a commitment, you referred to your manifesto promise, and you said it will be done. And my question is, how much has this government done towards bringing this Parliament Services Authority bill towards the Parliament since that? Even if you misled the people, totally can't use the word lied, so I want to be proper in terms of the parliamentary language, Mr. Vice President. But even if you mislead the people, you mislead the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, there was another occasion, there was another opportunity in May. But, Mr. Vice President, that manifesto, I think, sorry, I had the page here, but there were a number of other issues in that manifesto that came to Parliament, that legislation would have come, and when the legislation came, we realized this thing in the tail. And to me, one very famous one that every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago is affected by was the promise, the manifesto promise to reduce VAT. You know, so I'm hoping that this is not one of those, because the manifesto promise to reduce VAT from 15% to 12.5% did materialize. And they boast that they kept their promise. But they did not tell people this thing in the tail was increasing all those zero-rated items from 0 to 12.5%. So effectively, this government increased VAT, and they boasted that they will expect more revenue from VAT. So the fact is that they plan to hoodwink the nation. They plan to hoodwink the nation by making a promise that they had no intention of keeping. And they boast with their deception, Mr. Vice President. They boast and they show off. And at the end of the day, the effect on the citizen of this country, Mr. Vice President, is one that none of them could appreciate. Because I'm sure there's not a single member on the other side who would face a day when they cannot provide a meal for their children because of the increase in VAT. So that sort of deception, Mr. Vice President, I am detecting is continuing here. Because this is not the first time that the members are being asked about this House of Parliament Service Authority bill. This is not the first time that we are discussing or debating providing or strengthening the autonomy to the Parliament. And this is not the first time that the members opposite are referring to their manifesto. Mr. Vice President, there are a number of other deceptions contained in that manifesto. And Mr. Vice President, I don't want to turn this into my contribution into a piece about the deception of the PNM. But the fact is that the PNM has been very deceptive to this country. Yes. Very, very deceptive. Mr. Vice President, while the issue of Parliament and Parliament autonomy may not be viewed as one of the things to deal with the pressing social issues of our nation at this time, this is an opportunity for the...
Senator, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. This is an opportunity, Mr. Vice President, for the PNM, for this present government, to show that it genuinely meant something in that manifesto. That book of deception, those promises that were made to this country, those glitzy ads that they put up all over the place. Like it. When they made these promises, and the sad thing, Mr. Vice President, is that they continue to, well, now use government resources to continue propagating those promises that I don't see materializing.
Let's do this.
So, Mr. Vice President, the enthusiasm I had when I contributed to that debate last year is severely diminished. What I have seen from that time to now, I think the government had some time between May of last year and now to do some sort of work if their commitment of their word at that time was true and genuine. As of present, their indication for support of parliamentary autonomy stands. However, what I would like to see in terms of is them not trying to use the date being too short of to accomplish bringing legislation to Parliament as an excuse. But if this date is not reasonable, that they suggest a reasonable date, and that all heads are put together, and that the Parliament's instrument of a joint select committee be utilized to engage other stakeholders, to engage people even from other countries who could make recommendations as to what system will be suitable to allow for transparency and accountability when it comes to the taxpayers' dollars which would fund the Parliament, and providing that insulation from political creatures, regardless of who is the Minister of Finance at the time. So if the government is serious, if you are not going to continue on deception and so on, we will have some meaningful suggestions from the speakers opposite. But Mr. Vice President, unfortunately, I am not as enthusiastic this time, or as hopeful this time, of the PNM's promises. Thank you.
Senator Dookie.
Very delighted to join this debate and to share a few thoughts on the matter which is before us, and that is the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago and the intervention of autonomy, which I believe is a cross-disciplinary intervention, because I believe the issue of autonomy covers all organizational functioning of the Parliament. I also believe, as Senator Small would have indicated, that autonomy, in the context of parliamentary autonomy, warrants a discussion on the non-dependence and the non-subordination to the executive. And I think Senator Mark attempted to make a case for a corporate body type structure. Additionally, I think the issue of autonomy in this context also warrants an examination of the entire value chain of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. And in my view, more so the relationship Parliament enjoys with the executive parliamentarians, and more so the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Parliament as an organization begs the question in my mind, Mr. Vice President, what business are we in? And I think from the discourse thus far, we may agree that We are in the business of making good laws. We are in the business of providing oversight in terms of the executive. We are in the business, of providing good representation for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. But I wish to add to that, Mr. Vice President, and say that we are also in the business of producing good parliamentarians, because there is a causation effect. The higher quality parliamentarians we have and we develop over time, the better we will be in terms of producing laws, oversight, and representation. But also in the context of Parliament as an organization and the proposal for greater autonomy, a question that I would ask is, what is the problem we are attempting to solve? Or what are the problems we are attempting to solve? In other words, Mr. Vice President, what is the performance outcome we expect when we advocate parliamentary autonomy? Is it really that the challenge facing us as a parliament, Mr. Vice President, is the inability to recruit and select? Is it really that the challenge facing us as a parliament is the inability to promote training and development in the way we would like to? Is it really about some of the issues I would have heard today about the availability of dinner, or who is going to approve travel? What about, Mr. Vice President, the wider context of overall performance? Because I asked a question to myself, Mr. Vice President, as we advocate this intervention, what is really preventing us now from being more effective in terms of what we do, in terms of creating laws, representation, and providing oversight? I asked the question, Mr. Vice President, to myself, what is preventing us now as a parliament and as parliamentarians from designing and redesigning systems which will allow us to deliver better to the people of Trinidad and Tobago? What is preventing us now, Mr. Vice President, from engaging in interventions that will improve the skill set required by both parliamentarians and staff? And Mr. Vice President, is it really more urgent to engage as a solution autonomy? Or is it, Mr. Vice President, that one of the things we need to do and we can do now is to engage in a paradigm shift in terms of what we do, or more than that, how we do what we do as a parliament? Is it that we are advocating autonomy for the benefit of strengthening one side? Or is it that we are advocating autonomy so that we can finally get to a real place of co-opetition where, as a parliament and parliamentarians, in a competitive environment, we can compete and cooperate at the same time? And I pose a question again, Mr. Vice President, for consideration. What is more urgent? Is it the cry for autonomy? Or is it a need to engage in a shift in our paradigm in terms of how we can deliver better for the people of Trinidad and Tobago? Mr. Vice President, some would have referred to the PNM's manifesto. And when I say a paradigm shift, it brings me to the issue of parliamentarism. And I believe in the manifesto of the People's National Movement it was addressed. And permit me to read from it as I highlight some of the desirables as we promote parliamentarism. It says selflessness. Members of Parliament should act solely in terms of the public interest, contained in the manifesto of the People's National Movement. It says integrity. Members of Parliament must avoid placing themselves under any obligation to people or organizations that might try inappropriately to influence them in their work, or to act or take decisions in order to gain financial or other material benefits for themselves, their families, or their friends. They must disclose to the Parliament all potential conflict of interest. It says objectivity, Mr. Vice President. Members of Parliament must act and take decisions impartially, fairly, and on merit. It also says, Mr. Vice President, accountability. Members of Parliament must account to the public their decisions and actions and submit themselves to the scrutiny necessary to ensure this. I say this, Mr. Vice President, because I believe it is not deception. I think we have made this commitment to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and we have kept it, and we intend to continue to keep it as we progress in our term. So, Mr. Vice President, a lot has been said also about the concentration of executive power, or the executive dominance of the legislature. But what about, Mr. Vice President, the use of the legislature to frustrate the executive? Is that real? As Senator Baptiste Primus would have indicated, the issue of obstructionism, is that real? What about understanding and accepting, as we engage our duties in the Parliament, that the executive has been established in a democratic process and a democratic manner, according to the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago? And what about accepting the responsibility, Mr. Vice President, for the legislature to engage in action to provide greater support to the executive as a stakeholder, and also to provide support to other stakeholders of the Parliament? And that brings me, Mr. Vice President, to what I describe and define as the most important stakeholder, and that is the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. The citizens put a government in place to improve their circumstances, and they are going to hear, and they would have heard, the talk and the cry for greater autonomy. And they are going to ask the question, Mr. Vice President, how would this impact positively their circumstances? How would this impact delivery of goods and services? How would this impact security? How would this impact security? And I think, Mr. Vice President, if we argue the case for autonomy, then we have to show the relationship between the autonomy and improving the circumstances of our citizens. And our citizens, Mr. Vice President, in my estimation, also demands the opportunity for greater participation, for greater involvement. And of course, Mr. Vice President, parliaments around the world have engaged in the use of ICT to promote this type of participation. We would have heard about e-democracy, teledemocracy, cyber democracy, e-parliament, e-participation. And I think, Mr. Vice President, as we argue the case for greater autonomy, We must demonstrate to the people of the country that we are serious about giving them the opportunity to participate more in their affairs. And ICT has become a tool, Mr. Vice President, which has transformed the relationship parliaments enjoy with citizens. And of course, in our own context, we know that our parliament embraces the use of YouTube, emails, Twitter, to engage the public, and I advocate that this has to be continuously improved. But I say this in the context, Mr. Vice President, that if we are serious about giving the people the type of representation that they need, we would engage as a parliament more. We would engage as a parliament more seriously the use of ICT and other interventions to engage the citizens of the country. And I ask the question, in our current context, do we need greater autonomy to improve our performance regarding this intervention? Do we need greater autonomy as a parliament, Mr. Vice President, to allow for a deeper contribution from the people of Trinidad and Tobago? A lot has been said also about the issue of democracy. And I believe we live in a democratic republic. And I believe our parliament is a democratic institution. So certainly, Mr. Vice President, the People's National Movement support the construct of democracy. And if I can just highlight the work of Vidaras, Owen, and Williamson, who shows in their work, Madam President, that democratic institutions positively impact the well-being of citizens. They show, Mr. Vice President, in the context of the performance of Parliament, individual behavior and the performance of the Parliament have a direct impact on the well-being of citizens. They show, Mr. Vice President, that their work has proven that countries with greater access to democratic institutions show a higher level of well-being among their citizens and also a higher level of happiness because their work proves that there is a contemporaneous relationship between democracy and well-being. So certainly, Mr. Vice President, the People's National Movement support the construct of democracy. But what they went on to show, Mr. Vice President, that as a parliament, we ought not to engage in actions and engage in behavior and engage in decisions where citizens' confidence will be negatively impacted. And they went on to state, Mr. Vice President, that parliaments in their functioning must promote electoral accountability. They went on to show in their findings, Mr. Vice President, in the promotion of democracy, that parliaments, as I said before, must also produce good parliamentarians. And they went on to show as well, Mr. Vice President, in their work to support democracy and the strength of the parliament in relation to its citizens, or to the citizens of the various countries that they examine, that the work of the parliament must reduce corruption. And I think we have made progress in recent times regarding that. And these are the things, Mr. Vice President, some of the things that I think we can promote in our current construct. Not that we are saying autonomy is not desirable, but what I'm advocating and my message in my short contribution today, Mr. Vice President, is that I think there are solution opportunities in our current construct that we must engage as a parliament. Mr. Vice President, the Westminster system focuses a lot on what the literature describes as input legitimacy. But it also shows, Mr. Vice President, that there is a movement towards, and this is in the context of parliaments, there's a movement towards performance legitimacy. And if you examine the work of McCarthy, Lee, and Painter, you would find support for this philosophy. In an input-type legitimacy approach, you would find significant emphasis on controlling spending, on hiring and staffing, which we have advocated for administrative processes, which we would have alluded to today. But in a performance legitimacy type or output legitimacy type structure of parliament, which their work shows a lot of parliaments are moving towards, significant focus is placed on the quality of the product that Parliament produces. The quality of the product in terms of representation, oversight. And there is significant emphasis in the operations of Parliament today regarding performance reviews and an approach of target-based management, which the paper or the study done by these authors show that citizens are very receptive to the issue of performance legitimacy. And as an organization, Madam President, Parliament as an organization and Parliament as an institution, I ask the question, where are we as a parliament in terms of performance management? Where are we as a parliament in terms of target-based management? And I think as we advocate to the people, the call for greater autonomy as a parliament, I think it is instructive that we answer these questions. I also believe, Mr. Vice President, as we engage a discussion about autonomy, that we must also address autonomy in the context of the culture of our people, and maybe we have a more collectivist type culture. But a key question I think we must face and confront is how do our citizens as a stakeholder see us as a parliament? And Senator Small would have alluded to the issue of public opinion, and I agree with him. But have we considered how our citizens see us as we cry out for greater autonomy? We know how the Calypsonians see us. But are we convinced that we know for sure how our citizens view us as a parliament and as a parliament and as parliamentarians? Do they think that our work is part-time? Senator Small showed us a lot of work that he has to do tonight. Do they think that we work at all? Do they think that we are overpaid? And if they think we work, what value our citizens place on our work? I say that, Mr. Vice President, because I believe that our citizens will have a say regarding autonomy for the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. But as we advocate autonomy, Mr. Vice President, I think we must demonstrate small areas of successes, because small areas of success in our current construct can promote the acceptance of what we do, the acceptance of our work, and the need for greater autonomy. If our people, Mr. Vice President, see us as cooperating, then I believe they will support the argument for greater power and greater autonomy. If they see us cooperating while we debate in our JSEs at committee stage, then I'm convinced that they will be supportive. If they see us, Mr. Vice President, as less corrupt, as indeed we would have seen the recent findings regarding the perception of corruption in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, if our citizens see us this way, they will support our call for greater autonomy. Because rest assured, they would look at how we deal with the issue of accountability and the issue of procurement. If they see us as putting our country first, Mr. Vice President, they will respond in a positive manner. And as we argue, and as a call has been made for greater autonomy, Mr. Vice President, let me assure us that the people are looking on. And they have looked on. They saw, Mr. Vice President, how we dealt with FATCA. They saw as a parliament how we dealt with anti-gang. They saw how we dealt with procurement. They saw how we dealt with bail amendment. And Mr. Vice President, they are waiting to judge us as we call for greater autonomy. The people of Trinidad and Tobago will have a say. So, Mr. Vice President, as I summarize in closing, while there is support and significant support for autonomy, my message in my short contribution says that there are solutions, opportunities available in our current construct. I would have identified, Mr. Vice President, the opportunity available presently for the use of ICT to enhance citizens' participation and improve the quality of representation we give and provide as parliamentarians. Of course, these are the demands of citizens. I indicated, Mr. Vice President, that there may be the need for a paradigm shift, a mindset in our engagement of cooperation, co-opetition, as we work together for the overall good of our people. I would have indicated, Mr. Vice President, that there are opportunities for us to promote true parliamentarism. Understanding, Mr. Vice President, that there has to be a healthy relationship between the executive and the legislature. And oversight does not mean to frustrate, but rather to enable and to encourage for the overall good. I would have indicated, Mr. Vice President, that there are opportunities in our current construct to engage in interventions to improve the skill set required by parliamentarians and staff that will breed and enhance a performance culture that would augment the quality of what we produce as a parliament, and that is laws, oversight, and representation. I would have advocated in my own way, Mr. Vice President, the need to show small successes to our people, to demonstrate that we have earned the right, Mr. Vice President, to call for greater autonomy. Because, Mr. Vice President, what we do with what we have will influence whether or not we get more. I want to repeat that as I close, Mr. Vice President. As a parliament, parliament as an organization and parliament as an institution, what we do with what we have will influence whether or not we get more. And maybe, Mr. Vice President, it may not be about best practice, but in our current context and our current culture, it may be about right fit. or best fit, and maybe for consideration, Mr. Vice President, an incremental approach to this goal of autonomy may be useful. Mr. Vice President, with those few words, I thank you.
Senator Haynes.
As I rise today to contribute on this very important debate on parliamentary autonomy, I would just like to take a couple of minutes to reflect on the speaker before me, because my opening statement initially was to thank Senator Mark for bringing what I think is a forward-thinking and revolutionary motion on this idea of autonomy and what we should be moving towards, or the ideal that we should move towards. And I was very prepared to start off by saying that I have a sense of pride in contributing on a motion such as this today. Because when we talk about democracy and these ideals, I thought it was something that we can all agree upon. But the speaker before me had a lot of questions. And there was one concern that the senator kept echoing, which is there are opportunities within our current construct that would allow us. And then he said something that was very interesting, which was, have we earned the right to autonomy? And that what we do with what we have will determine if we can get more. And I think those are very interesting statements, given that I would like to reflect on when a motion similar to this was debated in 2016. And the leader of the government bench in the Senate, Senator Khan, said when Senator Mark piloted something that was similar, and he said, this has been debated 3 times already. Senator Khan said, and I quote here, "Madam President, I just want to go on record and say officially that Senator Mark is pushing against an open door. And during this term in office, we, and that's the PNM, are committed to parliamentary autonomy. Like many other things, it will happen in Trinidad and Tobago for the first time in conjunction with judicial, financial, and administrative autonomy. We are committed to those two: judicial autonomy, fiscal and financial, and parliamentary autonomy." So I can't understand what the movement backwards is, because I thought we were all in agreement. I assumed we were all in agreement that this was, at least in principle, a thing that we aspired to as a nation, and that we understood that our structures as they stand have been in place for a long time, and that the reform of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago was long overdue, and that we've had discussions over decades that have led us to this point, and that we were here to agree that our discussions should progress into action. And while we may disagree on when that action should take place, and Senator Mark has indicated April 2018, that we should not be regressive and go back to whether or not action should take place, but just a matter of when. And I think that it's important to note that the process towards the reform of the management structure of our parliament commenced in 1997. These discussions commenced in 1997 when a report of the House Committee of the House of Representatives identified a need for organizational trade for the parliament, which remained largely unaltered since 1962. So again, to address a number of your concerns, Senator Dookie, it is not so much what we can do in our present construct, but what we can do as a parliament to improve the institution that we have now. I think Senator Batiste, the Minister of Labour, noted with a lot of pride that the PNM built every single institution of democracy. And even, but now we're here in a private motion asking you to strengthen it. So I thought after you said that the debate was going to end there because we were all in agreement that if you build the institution, well, Senator Dookie didn't necessarily agree. Yes, yes. So that what we're saying, what we're asking is that
Well, I needed to brief Dookie. He said something very...
what we're asking is that we come together. Oh.
Members, please allow the senator to make a contribution. I'm hearing a lot of crosstalk coming forward, and I can't exactly hear what she's saying. Senator, continue.
Thank you. You know, what we're asking...
Crosstalk continue, Mr. Chair, Vice President.
What we're asking is to come together, that we all collectively agree that our institution, that the institution that is Parliament should have autonomy, and that the autonomy will enable us to function to serve the needs of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. What we do here must serve not only our present generation, but we must act in a manner that will create institutions that will serve the future of Trinidad and Tobago. And so what Senator Mark is asking for is just quite simply a step into the future. And we should be able to all agree that, and I think Senator Dookie also asked, you know, well, how would this benefit or serve the demands of the citizens? And I think one of the key demands of the citizens is good governance, and that they hope that when we come together and when we discuss issues, that the interests of the people remain paramount. And I just want to go back to the timelines, since if the issue now is the April 2018, you know, it gives the impression that this is a new discussion or something that has just appeared on, and we need time and that we need more time. But you know, in 2000 there was a special select committee, and then in 2011 a document that Senator Mark referred to, which was the agreement signed between the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago and the UNDP. And that looked at strengthening the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, and a key component of strengthening the Parliament was parliamentary autonomy. And in 2014, there was the draft Houses of Parliament bill, which is the bill that Senator Mark is asking that we can look at. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel or go backwards or figure out where we should be going. That work has already been done. What we have to do now is commit to action. And I really was prepared to have one of those debates where we all agreed, and one of those rare days in adversarial politics where we all said, well, yes, this is something that is good for the nation, and this is a legacy that we would like to leave as a parliament, because we all make up the parliament, opposition, government, independent, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. We are the parliament, so we can have a goal or an aspirational goal for ourselves. And that's all that we were asking that we commit to action this item. You know, we have as our job a primary legislative function. And one of the ways to enhance the effectiveness of lawmaking and good governance is, as Senator Small noted, you know, having an adequately staffed and resourced parliament. And it's not so much the question of doing the best with what you have, but are we producing what is ultimately good for the citizens of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago? You know, and this was an appropriate opportunity for us to discuss, again, what our aspirational goals are. And we do see a lot of dissonance in society and a lot of people who ultimately feel very disconnected from the process and what happens here. And we can fix that, I believe, if we open up the spaces for more effective scrutiny of the executive. And this comes with the strengthening of Parliament. I just want to take a moment to address something that I've noticed in my short time in this Parliament. We all agree that a critical part of the oversight function of the Parliament is scrutiny of the executive. And we have here, when we look at the progression, one of the steps that we can look at that strengthened our Parliament was the new standing orders that happened in the last incarnation of this Parliament, which introduced something that I was very proud to have been part of the discussions, which was Prime Minister's question time. This is a way that citizens get to, again, get answers and accountability and oversight. We have here parliamentary question time. And it's on the rarest occasion that I would ask a question during question time, and that is by choice, because oftentimes what is meant to be a space to have a clear account and a mature response on what the actions the government or the executive is taking, or that role of the executive accounting to the Parliament, I think dissolves into something less than what it ought to be. We have what we see. No question, no question. What we see is persons coming and giving answers that, and I think it comes from that perhaps it may be that you don't feel to answer Senator Mark or Senator Hussein or that, but the idea is that you are accounting to the population of Trinidad and Tobago. So today, when Senator Mark asked for specifics from the Minister of National Security, he gave what was a very general answer and did not answer the question. And so Senator Mark was forced to reword the question and try again. And this idea of having to force this accountability and force this oversight is precisely some of the checks that we are trying, some of the things we are trying to guard against. We are looking, right? What we are looking for is to build the Parliament up. Yes, we would build the Parliament, and so that the Parliament will not just merely be seen as a space for the executive, any executive, to continue its narrative, whether or not the narrative is false, but to be a space that people feel genuinely represented. A lot of the questions that we raise come from regular citizens. A lot of the motions on the adjournment, we don't come up with these things out of thin air. And so I think the idea is that we need to find a way for society to once again feel connected to the political process. How does autonomy factor into that? Because once we, as a Parliament, begin to understand our role and function apart from the executive and what it means for representation, and when we begin to ask ourselves the tough questions, are we truly representative? Are we truly transparent? Are we truly accessible? Are we truly accountable? And most importantly, are we effective? when we begin to ask these questions, we can think about how these factor in to what we ultimately want to do when we talk about things like autonomy and things like the checks and balances and the separation of powers.
Mr. Vice President, I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, 13 March 2018 at 1:30 p.m. During that sitting, we intend to finally conclude the debate on mutual assistance in criminal matters bill.
Honourable Senators, before I put the question on the adjournment, leave has been granted for 2 matters to be raised on the motion for the adjournment of the Senate. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, would-be authoritarians and autocrats utilize the institutions such as the intelligence services as weapons against the democratic and civil liberties of the citizens in their drive to injure, harm, transparency, accountability, and openness. Intelligence services whose intentions are anti-democratic and anti-people rely on secrecy and an absence of transparency in conducting their work. Mr. Vice President, the SSA Act of 1995, Act 24, Section 14, states, and I quote, "Subject to negative resolution of Parliament, the Minister, in this instance the Minister of National Security, may make regulations generally to give effect to this Act, and in particular regarding 1, the exercise of the powers and the performance of the duties and functions of the agency, and 2, the conduct and discipline of employees and the disciplinary procedures to be observed in the adjudication of grievances." Mr. Vice President, we are governed by the rule of law and not the diktat of autocrats. There's no one above the law, including the Minister of National Security, the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet. None is above the law. But, Mr. Vice President, it is now 23 years almost. And even though we were promised in 2016, when we spent night after night debating the SSA, the government of this country, through the Attorney General, promised us that the regulations governing the SSA will be tabled in short order. Today, Mr. Vice President, no regulations. Mr. Vice President, there are no checks and balances. The SSA is a runaway horse. No checks and balances, Mr. Vice President. And therefore, there are large spaces created for corruption, nepotism, favoritism, and the misuse and abuse of power and resources. Mr. Vice President, would you believe in the past few months, scores of workers and employees have been summarily dismissed by the director, acting obviously on the instructions of the government. And the Minister of National Security must tell this Parliament today what role he had to play in instructing the director of the SSA to dismiss over 55 workers. What was his role in this matter? And the Prime Minister's role, because the Prime Minister is the head of the National Security Council. Mr. Vice President, people have been dismissed, according to reports, without sound industrial relations practices being observed by this government. Mr. Vice President, I want to make reference to articles in the Newsday of Wednesday, the 31st of January, 2018. The headline is, former SSA officers former officers accuse SSA director of nepotism. And Mr. Vice President, in that article, 35 members of that agency were dismissed by, in the month of January of 2018. In fact, 2 months after 35 members of that agency were fired, 2 former members, so they were fired in November, Mr. Vice President. It was Wednesday in November. I can't remember the exact date, but it was in November. And they were dismissed, and they were offered no explanation. They were given no reason that one can rely on for their dismissal. Mr. Vice President, in fact, it is reported in the Newsday of the same date, Wednesday the 31st of January, that they were quoted as saying that the SSA fired them because they failed a company examination. But none of us underwent any kind of examination. So how could you fail a man if you had no examination? These are pieces of information appearing in the newspapers, and the Minister of National Security has said nothing about it, Mr. Vice President. And we go on to another article on Thursday, the 16th of November, when the 35 workers were dismissed. And what are they saying, Mr. Vice President? They are saying that they are engaging in some restructuring of the SSA. Well, there's a famous word. When you want to fire people, you say restructuring. So they are restructuring, and they have dismissed in phases. Phase 1, 35. Phase 2, 17. Or I think it's phase 1, 17. Phase 2, 35. Phase 3, I think that's 7 more. And the minister may want to tell us how many workers have been dismissed since the new director, Robinson, took charge of that agency. We would like him to tell us how many have gone. Mr. Vice President, you know what employees are saying according to this article? And I quote, the terminated employees said the organization was being used as a political tool, and only those who were favored by some of the directors had been promised security of tenure. Another affected worker said, according to the article, some of his colleagues who were not favored by the SSA directors reported for work but were given nothing to do. Mr. Vice President, these are some of the stories that we have coming out of the SSA. The SSA has become a dark blot on the landscape of this country. This is a local SSA. Is that part of the experience that we have had, Mr. Vice President, in Nazi Germany? What is happening here? Mr. Vice President, this is a democracy, and I want to tell you, the CIA has checks and balances. The FBI has checks and balances. The MI5 has checks and balances. In Trinidad and Tobago, the government has removed from the Freedom of Information Act the SSA. The government has refused, 23 years after, Mr. Vice President, to bring regulations to govern this agency. You have 1 more minute. Yes. So I am calling on the minister to level with the population. How many workers have been fired? Why have they been fired? When are you bringing the regulations, Mr. Vice President? And what checks and balances are you offering the people of this country to ensure that you don't reach despotism, nepotism, corruption, favoritism, and an abuse and misuse of power? I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, As I sat here and listened to Senator Mark, I threw my mind back to my days in school, listening to Shakespeare, who once says, the eye sees not itself but by reflection. And I surmise that by saying we are, yeah. You see, our perspectives are based to a large extent on our experiences. Our perspectives are based to a large extent on our experiences. And I know for a fact that Senator Mark's experiences between 2010 to 2015, with respect to the SSA, is what is reflecting on him today. I believe this is where he's getting his incentive from. You see, of course, you see, Mr. Vice President, I do not feel that Senator Mark nor the last administration have any moral authority whatsoever to talk about responsibility and accountability with respect to the Strategic Services Agency. Mr. Vice President, between 2010 and 2015, when the last administration took over the reins of power, one of the first things they did was to dismantle the security agencies in Trinidad and Tobago. And more importantly, or more specifically, dismantle the Strategic Services Agency. And they did that in a manner to put this country's security in jeopardy, Mr. Vice President. To put this country's security at risk for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. They destroyed it completely, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the Strategic Services Agency was established in 1995, now Chapter 1506, pursuant to Section 6 of the Strategic Services Act, Chapter 1506. This agency was charged with responsibility for our national security, for intelligence gathering. Mr. Vice President, when one look at what happened between 2010 and 2015, one can recall the last administration with no accountability, no responsibility, which is the buzzword of Senator Mark, fired the then director, Nigel Clement, without any reason whatsoever, without any justification. Where was the transparency then? Where was the accountability then, Mr. Vice President? Where was it during that period? As a matter of fact, the state, this government had to pay Mr. Nigel Clement for the actions of that administration, for the callousness with which they destroyed that gentleman's career, Mr. Vice President. Accountability and transparency. Mr. President, who did they hire as the director then? Who did they hire the director then? No advertisement, no selective processes, a computer technician, telephone operator, was then appointed the director of SSA. Where was the accountability? Where was the responsibility? You are coming to this house now to ask this administration about accountability and responsibility? Come on. And the people of Trinidad and Tobago that I'm talking to, the people of the Trinidad and Tobago that I'm reminding the people of Trinidad and Tobago, I'm reminding the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Never.
Mr. Vice President, I apologize. I apologize. I apologize.
Take it easy.
What? 5 minutes?
Everyone, take it easy.
I listened as Senator Mark made his contribution with all the passion in the world, and there was silence. Please allow the Minister of National Security the same courtesy. Silence when he's making his contribution. Continue.
I want us to remind the population of Trinidad and Tobago, who I'm speaking to right now, of the callousness, of the recklessness of the last administration with respect to destroying the Strategic Services Agency. And I will remind them, and will continue so to do, in and outside this house. Yes.
Senators, again, I'm not going to say it again. Complete silence when he's making his contribution. Senator, continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the truth hurts, you know. Yes. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. Mr. Vice President, and it goes on, you know. It goes on. Because after they finished appointing Rishmi as the director, they went on again to bring on Mr. Bisnath Maharaj. No selective processes whatsoever. He was selected and handpicked as the director. Where was the transparency? Where was the accountability then? Where was it? It was non-existent during that time, Mr. Vice President. To the extent where, again, this government had to end up restructuring. And this is why we had to restructure, you know. We had to rebuild the Strategic Services Agency because it was destroyed, completely destroyed by the last administration. And therefore, the restructuring had to take place as a matter of urgency to provide for the security of this Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And, Mr. Vice President, I can tell you that this government put in place a strategic service agency that will be done to the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago. One that is restructured and is based on accountability and transparency, Mr. Vice President. So, Vice President, in our selection process, the director of the strategic service has the remit to do his advertisement, to select his people, and this is done in a very transparent manner, an accountable manner. We have the following steps are, in fact, done in terms of selection processes in the SSA. There are written assessments which never happened before in 2010, 2011, psychometric testing, security vetting, interviews, polygraph examinations, medical examinations. Again, these things were suspended between 2010 and 2015. As a matter of fact, the process was in such a way that the director then, members of his family were seen to be recruited and selected or employed. Members of politicians on the other side were employed. And I'm stating this because I can support them. I can support them with facts. I will call no name because that is not my character so to do. But I can tell you, during that last administration, it was no transparency. Corruption took place to the extent where family members were recruited and employed. Members from MP offices were employed in the strategic services with no vetting whatsoever and paid very handsome salaries, Mr. Vice President. Accountability and transparency? Come on, Senator Mark. Do your homework. Do your homework. And understand that you can't bring these kinds of motions here when you have so many things to answer during the period that you were in power.
We think you're a dictator.
Your words, not mine. But let's talk to the population. Let the people understand what we are talking about. Let them understand what we are talking about. And so, Mr. Vice President, the SSA personnel regulations to codify and expand the recruitment and discipline process were presented to the LRC, and I'll give you a status report. They were in fact at the LRC right now with a view to bringing them before the House, Mr. President. And that is being worked on as we speak. But when we look at the recruitment process under this administration, a candidate for appointment of director or deputy director, which is contrary to what happened in the last, must be a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, not less than 18 years of age, required to pass a medical examination and conducted by a registered medical practitioner. Successfully clear the security vetting process. That didn't happen, Mr. Vice President. Required to undergo psychophysical detection, deception examination, psychological testing, and testing for drugs. In the last administration, these things did not occur. No accountability, no transparency, Mr. Vice President. So, Vice President, I can assure you that under this administration, the restructured Strategic Services Agency is now an agency that is professionally developed, professionally managed to treat the issues of security of Trinidad and Tobago. Accountability and transparency are the hallmark of that agency, Mr. President, and it will redound to the benefit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you.
Senator Mark, next motion.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Vice President, over the last few months, we have observed a trend involving government ministers seeking by their public utterances to influence directly and indirectly the determination of rate increases for TNTech customers and for WASA customers. I was astonished to have read some time ago that the Minister of Public Utilities, the Honorable Senator Robert Lee Hunt, is reported to have insinuated in an article in the business news, Loop News they call it, on October the 11th, 2017, when the headline read, Minister, TNT too dependent on government subsidies. And in that article in the Loop newspaper, the Honorable Minister went on to indicate that an increase in utility rates is pending, as the RIC is currently reviewing these rates. Now, Mr. Vice President, this is a salvo issued by the minister. Then I go to another article in the Trinidad Guardian on Sunday, December the 31st, 2017, written by a lady called Salisa Hassan Ali. The headline is, WASA overstaffed by 2,000 employees. And again, in this article, the minister indicates, and he hasn't denied it, rate increases coming next year. And I waited from December to now to see if the Honorable Minister Robert Lee Hunt would have denied the statement attributed to have been made by him, by this writer in The Guardian, Salisa Hassan Ali. There was no rebuttal. So I can only assume that the Honorable Minister made these remarks. You cannot come today to deny that. You should have denied that before. So, Mr. Vice President, here it is, a minister who is supposed to be neutral in these matters is indicating to the country when there's an independent commission established under law called the Regulated Industries Commission, whose mandate is to determine these matters, is being determined for us by what a minister says. So is Hyacinth Guy, the chairman of the RIC, a puppet, a stooge, or a tool of the government? Mr. Vice President, it becomes, it becomes even more interesting as we proceed. I go to the Guardian of October the 6th, Friday, and the headline is, WASA TNTech rate review to be completed. But what is even more interesting here is that before any consultation is made, the Minister of Finance gets into the dance. And not only does he get into the dance, you have the lady who is in charge, Hyacinth Guy, who is supposed to be the person making the decision, even before consultation is had, projecting increases in utility rates for both TNTech and for water, WASA. Mr. Vice President, what is going on in Trinidad and Tobago? Have we lost our marbles? How can a chairman of an independent commission, before you do a final review, could be predicting increases in rates for TNTech people, customers, and for WASA employees? I quote, I go to the Minister of Finance first. Imbert, according to this article, says the new rates will be imposed in 2018. This is Mr. Imbert. The new rates will be imposed in 2018, Mr. Vice President. Now, it goes on. Guy, who is the Hyacinth Guy, chairman. Well, you want to speak for me? Well, allow me to speak now. I am quoting, Mr. Vice President, I am quoting from the newspaper. I am not quoting. Mr. Vice President, protect me from this invasion of my space. Of my space. Mr. Vice President, may I go continue with your protection? Please.
Members, we don't have long again. This is a motion on the adjournment. Please allow the member to make his contribution with silence in the chamber so that we can complete this motion in the adjournment. Continue, Senator Mark.
Don't let them distract you.
I know she has a special place in her heart for me. Mr. Vice President, may I continue? Guy, and my friend told me, Dr. Hyacinth Guy, said the RIC has been working apace with the review process for the last few months. It goes on. Once the reviews are completed, Mr. Vice President, listen carefully. Mr. Vice President, listen to the language coming from this lady, and it's being quoted. Once the reviews are completed, the new rates will be handed over to WASA and TNTEC, following which the population would be informed what the tariffs would be. Mr. Vice President, Hyacinth Guy, Dr. Hyacinth Guy, the chairman of the RIC, should tender her resignation immediately from the RIC. Mr. Vice President, how can a person who has been appointed here and supposed to be objective, not a consultation has been held in this country on WASA increases or TNTEC increases. And here you have the chairman of this RIC telling the country, once the reviews are completed, the new rates will be handed over to WASA and TNTEC, following which the population would be informed what the targets would be. Mr. Vice President, how does this lady know that after the various consultations, there will be an increase in rates? She cannot predict that, Mr. Vice President. That is a matter that that must go through phases and processes and stages. And this lady is predicting increases. Mr. Vice President, did that come about as a result of the promptings by Senator the Honorable Robert Lee Hunt? Did it come about as a result of the promptings made by the Minister of Finance? Who was responsible for telling and directing the chairman of the Regulated Industries Commission? You see, all this consultation is a charade, is a puppy show. Because you know what happened? We have already decided that there will be rate increases for TNTEC and for WASA. So what is going on, Mr. Vice President? And that is why I raise this matter. Not to bring my good friend out of Ghana, who is now in Trinidad, Senator the Honorable Lee Hunt. It's not to bring him into any disrepute. But I want to tell the Honorable Minister that it is not his business to predict rate increases. That is not your business. And the business of the Minister of Finance is not to tell the country that in 2018, rates will be imposed for both water and TNTEC. And Mr. Vice President, what is even more egregious is for the RIC chairman to come and tell this country that there will be increases even before the consultation process has been concluded. Mr. Vice President, this is not only an assault on our democracy, This is not only an assault on the RIC as an institution, it is a complete undermining, subversion of the entire process that warrants an objective, independent investigation into all the factors that would eventually determine whether there should be a rate increase or there should not be a rate increase. I reiterate, for the immediate resignation of Dr. Hyacinth Guy as the RIC, and I call Mr. Vice President in closing for this whole exercise involving the RIC to recommence, because it is riddled with bias. It is riddled, Mr. Vice President, with bias, and therefore we call for answers from the government on this travesty that is taking place. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Minister of Public Utilities.
A privilege to respond to this motion raised by Senator Mark, as it will allow me the opportunity to set the record straight on an important issue, not only for our colleagues here in this august chamber, but also for the broader national community. This is not the first time that Senator Mark is making this type of accusation in the House. Last year, during his contribution in 2017 budget debate, he articulated a similar position. At that time, during my maiden address, I attempted, best as I could, to respond to that position and put to rest this whole idea and to place in Hansard my position. And I quote, at that time I said, there was a certain statement made when the debate started by Senator Mark to give the impression that I or this government is going to increase water rates. That is far from the truth. We do not have the responsibility to do that. It is being done by the RIC, and they will give their evaluation after going through an elaborate process. End of quote. At the Trinidad and Tobago Energy Chamber held in January of this year, I again highlighted the inclusive nature of the rate review process by saying, and I quote, there's a lot of discussion that are required with the public. There are a lot of service contractors or service agreements that need to be put in place and agreed upon. And when the Regulatory Industries Commission is finished, they will make their pronouncement. Subsequently, I gave interviews both on the radio and in print, where I expanded on the points made in my budget presentation in related to the RIC. In a Trinidad and Tobago Guardian article published on February 23rd of this year, for example, I was quoted as saying that, with regard to the TNTEX application for a rate increase, officials were following the process as stipulated by the Regulated Industry Commission, RIC. I also said in that interview, and I quote, although it is important to follow the process, we have to ensure the inefficiencies of the organization are not passed on to the consumers via the rate increase. End of quote. Mr. Vice President, there is a saying that my grandmother told me that I live by, and it's that the truth will set you free. As leaders and citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, we have the responsibility to guide our fellow citizens in the right direction. I have always made the point that leadership is not about being the prime minister. It is not about being the leader of government business. It is not just about sitting here in the House. Leadership could come from anyone in any quarters. And as such, at all levels of leadership, we have a responsibility to guide the people in the right direction. I have also, on many occasions, highlighted very clearly one fundamental principle of Economics 101, which states that there is no free lunch. You will recall, Madam President, that Mr. Vice President, that even in his budget presentation, the Honorable Minister of Finance spoke about the false economy that obtains here in Trinidad and Tobago. And he noted we live in a society where the average citizen does not appreciate the true worth of the services that he benefits from, because these things have been heavily subsidized and because he has not been called upon to pay the true price. In the case of the public utilities, Mr. Vice President, I have joined that clarion call to change our perception of these services and the values that we attribute to them. It cannot be business as usual. And my contribution to that ongoing conversation was to place on the national agenda the facts, unpleasant as they may be, as it relates to our public utility services, and putting our heads in the sand will not change these facts. As such, I have been on record speaking about customer service. I have been on record speaking about conservation. I have revealed and put squarely on the national agenda the reality of the prices that we pay for water and electricity in this country, vis-à-vis the prices that is paid around the world, which, Mr. Vice President, presently is one of the lowest. And I have drawn the link between those relatively low prices and the level of wastage that obtains here, both in our use of electricity and in our use of water. The fact, every time we commission lights in community public spaces, I have urged residents to conserve electricity with the overall aim of conserving our natural gas resources, which can then be used to bring more revenue into the country. Mr. Vice President, water and energy conservation, a topic that are currently being discussed at various global fora. The Global Water Institute, in a recent report, noted around 700 million people in 43 countries suffer from water scarcity. UNESCO estimates that the number will increase to 1.8 billion people by the year 2025. Meanwhile, we live in a country where the average person uses between 4 to 5 times the daily water usage recommended by the United Nations. And so, we as a nation must address our patterns of conservation and the way in which we preserve and treat with our resources. This has been highlighted in my conversations in the public domain, not the raising of public utility rates, as the Senator Mark would have us believe. Mr. Vice President, which brings me to another point that I have consistently raised, the importance of improving the productivity and quality of service of our utilities under my purview. The RIC process for rate reviews include the review of service levels, and so my emphasis on improving service levels is an attempt to prepare the organization under my purview for this process, and more importantly, to ensure that any inefficiencies in the system are not passed on to the customer via any increase. In short, Mr. Vice President, what I've attempted to do over the past few months is to prepare both the organizations under my purview and the general population, not for a rate increase, but for the rate review that is stipulated under the RIC Act, and which I have said before plays an important role in keeping the public utilities healthy and viable. Mr. Vice President, we all are aware of the laws governing the RIC. As a matter of fact, the RIC is an independent organization. The board of directors of the RIC are protected by statute. They are appointed by the president, and their tenure is also protected by statute. The RIC has a clear process that talks about consultation, a broad degree of consultation, and ensures that it is very fair, and ensures that whatever their final ruling is one that is first published, discussed, get feedback before a decision is made. I could speak here under no circumstances. Again, my purview and my intentions during my conversations was to put squarely on the national agenda the facts regarding to the public utilities, the rates that are being charged, our conservation of water, and what we need to do going forward. Maybe I live in a utopia world, and I would have thought that Senator Mark...
Minister, time is up. Honourable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, the 13th of March, 2018 at 1:30 p.m. All in favor say aye. Aye. All against say no. The ayes have it. This Senate now stands adjourned to Tuesday, the 13th of March, 2018 at 1:30 p.m.